My wife said at the party, "Back off." When I went to hug her as everyone watched, by morning, her whole double life was laid bare. My wife pushed me away so hard that night, a public humiliation that nearly shattered my drink. But it wasn't the rejection that broke me, it was the chilling realization that my entire marriage had been a carefully orchestrated lie. We were at a corporate party in Phoenix, the air thick with forced cheer and cheap champagne. I'd reached out to hug Chloe, my wife of 12 years, when she recoiled as if burned. "Don't touch me," she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went silent, that suffocating kind of silence where you can practically hear people holding their breath. I stood there, hands still half raised, frozen in what felt like an eternity, while Chloe just turned back to her conversation circle, as if nothing had happened. The true gut punch wasn't her rejection, but the utter lack of surprise on anyone else's face. People quickly looked away, some suddenly engrossed in their phones. One guy, someone I barely knew, gave me a look of pity that made my stomach churn. That's when I saw Liam Miller standing beside Chloe, closer than any coworker should be, his hand casually resting on the small of her back. Liam, a senior analyst in her department, seemed to be at every company event Chloe attended. I'd met him a few times, always the same polite smile and firm handshake. The kind of man who seems perfectly harmless until you realize he's been playing chess while you're still figuring out the rules. He just stood there, calm, almost bored, like he was watching a movie he'd already seen. Chloe was wearing the navy dress I'd complimented that morning, the one with silver details she said made her feel confident. She'd spent an hour getting ready, which wasn't unusual, but now every detail replayed in my mind with a sick, new clarity. She hadn't asked me how I looked, barely spoke in the car, and drifted straight to Liam's group the moment we walked in. I'd told myself she was networking, being professional. But standing there, my drink getting warm in my hand, everyone pretending they hadn't just witnessed my humiliation, I felt like the biggest fool in the room. A few minutes later, Grace, Chloe's sister, appeared at my elbow. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her voice low and careful. I knew she'd seen everything. Grace was the only one in Chloe's family who ever treated me like a person, not just an accessory to her sister's perfect life. So, instead of the polite lie I was preparing, I gave her the truth. "Bad night," she tried to soften it, to give me an out. I looked her dead in the eye and said something I didn't even know I was thinking, "No." "The last one." Grace's face shifted then, a flicker of something that might have been relief or maybe guilt. She nodded slowly, squeezed my arm, and disappeared back into the crowd. I was left with the distinct feeling I'd just crossed an invisible line. The party dragged on for another hour. Chloe didn't look at me once. I watched her laugh at Liam's jokes, saw her lean in when he whispered something. Her entire body language shifted when he was around, open and animated in a way she hadn't been with me in years. By the time we left, I'd made a decision, though I couldn't have told you exactly what it was yet. The drive home was silent. Chloe turned off the radio the second we got in the car. She stared out the passenger window, jaw tight, hands folded in her lap like she was physically restraining herself. At the house, she went straight to the bathroom and locked the door. Bizarre. In 12 years, she'd never locked that door. I stood in the hallway, listening to the water run, and a cold certainty settled over me. Something fundamental had broken tonight, and it wasn't getting fixed. I went to the kitchen, poured a whiskey I didn't want, and noticed Chloe's purse on the counter. I'm not the kind of person who goes through other people's things, never have been. Trust was always more important than proof. But my hand reached for that purse before I'd even made a conscious choice. Inside, I found a second phone. A cheap, prepaid burner that definitely wasn't the iPhone she carried everywhere. My hands shook as I turned it on. The first message made my blood run cold. "Tomorrow night, room 519. Can't wait." It was from Liam, sent earlier that day. I scrolled up and found months of messages, hotel confirmations, inside jokes about me, discussions about their future, conversations about how long Chloe needed to keep up appearances before she could leave. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, sat at the kitchen table with my whiskey, my mind racing. Every late night at the office, every weekend business trip, they all replayed with horrifying clarity. Chloe came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later, makeup scrubbed off, looking tired and small. I might have felt sorry for her if I hadn't just read those messages. She didn't say goodnight, just walked past me like I was furniture, and went upstairs. I stayed at that table until 3 a.m., not drinking, not moving. The worst part wasn't the cheating. It was how easy she thought this would be, how completely she believed I'd never look deeper, never question, never fight back. She built this entire second life right under my nose and hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly because she was that confident I'd never notice. That moment at the party, her casual cruelty, it wasn't spontaneous. It was a public declaration that I didn't matter, that whatever we had was over, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I'd already started planning my next move. I didn't have all the details yet, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to be the fool in this story anymore. I still didn't know who else was involved or how deep this went, but I felt it, this sense that I was standing alone in a room where everyone else already knew the ending. That feeling, more than anything, told me this was bigger than just Chloe and Liam. I was about to find out how wrong I'd been about everything. I barely slept 3 hours before calling Grace, Chloe's sister, the next morning, asking her to meet me for coffee. I kept it casual, just said I needed to talk. She agreed immediately, too immediately, like she'd been expecting this call. We met at a small cafe in downtown Phoenix, the kind of place where nobody from Chloe's social circle would accidentally run into us. Grace looked nervous the second she sat down. She ordered a latte she didn't drink, fidgeted with her cup sleeve, and wouldn't make eye contact for the first few minutes. I didn't push, just let the silence stretch until she couldn't take it anymore. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and tinged with guilt. "Liam influences Chloe more than you think," she said, like she was confessing something she'd held onto for months. My chest tightened. I asked what she meant, keeping my voice calm, even as my heart pounded. She looked at me with an expression that was half pity, half relief. She wouldn't give me details, wouldn't say exactly what she knew. But her constant apologies, saying she should have told me sooner, made it clear this wasn't news to her. Grace had known, maybe not everything, but enough. And she'd stayed quiet while I walked around like an idiot, thinking my marriage was just going through a rough patch. I left that cafe feeling sick. Not because of what Grace had said, but because of what she hadn't. All those careful pauses and loaded glances that told me this went deeper than one affair. I was halfway home when my phone rang. Susan, Chloe's mother. I almost didn't answer. Talking to Susan was usually an exercise in being lectured about my shortcomings. But something made me pick up. Her voice was cold and rehearsed. Within 30 seconds, I understood this call wasn't random. "You're holding her back," Susan said, no greeting, no pretense of concern, straight into the attack. She went on about how Chloe needed space to grow, how I was making things harder than they needed to be, how a real husband would understand when it was time to step aside. The whole speech had this weird, scripted quality. I realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a concerned mother calling to check on her daughter's marriage. This was damage control, someone trying to get ahead of a story they knew was about to break. Susan had never liked me, that wasn't new. But this was different. This was coordinated. She was talking to me like the decision had already been made, like my role was just to sign whatever papers they put in front of me and disappear quietly. I hung up on her mid-sentence, something I'd never done before, and sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process it. At home, Chloe was at work, or so she said. I went straight to her office, where she kept her personal documents. The second phone was gone from her purse. She'd obviously realized I might look. But people hiding things always make mistakes, and Chloe was no exception. I found a tablet she rarely used, shoved in the back of her desk drawer. It was still logged into her email. There were messages from Liam, casual and familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, dinner plans, weekend trips, inside jokes going back months. But what caught my attention was a message from 3 weeks ago with the subject line "Next Steps." When I opened it, my entire world shifted. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning my exit, discussing how to position me as unstable, how to make sure Chloe got the house and most of our assets, even talking about witnesses who could testify to my supposed erratic behavior. Grace's name was in that email, along with a question about whether she'd be willing to make a statement. I took photos of everything with my own phone, my hands steady, even though I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Then I put the tablet back exactly where I'd found it. That's when I decided to call a private investigator. Not because I needed more proof for myself, but because I needed documentation that would hold up if this turned into a legal battle. I found Marcus Thorne through a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. When we met the next day, Marcus listened to my story without interrupting. He was in his 50s, calm and professional, the kind of guy who'd seen every variation of human betrayal and wasn't impressed by any of it anymore. "If this is real, it won't take long," he said. Something about his confidence made me feel less crazy, like maybe I wasn't overreacting or imagining conspiracies. Marcus worked fast. Within 2 weeks, he came back with a folder so thick I needed both hands to carry it. Photos of Chloe and Liam at restaurants, hotels, his apartment, her car parked outside his building overnight. Credit card statements showing charges at expensive hotels on nights Chloe told me she was at business conferences. Phone records with hundreds of calls and texts between them going back almost a year. Even bank transfers, Chloe moving money from our joint account into a separate one I didn't know existed, small amounts at first, getting bigger over time. Marcus had timeline charts, location data, witness statements from hotel staff who recognized them as regulars. They hadn't been careful. They hadn't really tried to hide anything because they genuinely didn't think I was enough of a threat to bother covering their tracks. The worst part came when Marcus showed me the last piece of evidence, a recording he'd gotten from a source he wouldn't name. It was Chloe and Liam in his car, parked somewhere private, talking about the divorce they were planning. Chloe's voice was different, lighter, more animated than I'd heard it in years. Talking about how easy it would be to paint me as controlling and jealous, how her family would back her up completely, how I'd probably just accept whatever settlement they offered because I always took the path of least resistance. Liam encouraged her, making jokes about how I'd looked at the party when she pushed me away, calling me pathetic in that casual way that told me this wasn't the first time they'd discussed me like this. I listened to the whole thing in Marcus's office, my face probably blank because I'd run out of emotional reaction somewhere around the hotel photos. When it was over, Marcus asked what I wanted to do next. I told him to keep digging, find everything. Because if they thought I was going to roll over and make this easy, they'd seriously miscalculated who they were dealing with. That night, Grace called me, her voice shaking. "They asked me to testify against you," she said, crying on the other end. She said Chloe had called her that afternoon, casual and friendly, working the conversation around to asking if Grace would tell a lawyer about times I'd seemed angry or unreasonable or difficult. Grace had refused, which was why she was calling me now, guilt and panic making her words tumble out. I thanked her for telling me, kept my voice gentle even though I wanted to scream, and told her not to worry, that I had everything under control. I didn't, not really, but saying it made it feel more true. I spent the rest of that night going through Marcus's folder again, organizing everything chronologically, building a picture in my mind of how long this had been going on, and how many people had known, while smiling to my face. They thought I was quiet because I was broken, too passive to fight back, too in love with Chloe to see what was right in front of me. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't quiet because I'd given up. I was quiet because I was preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I needed to make sure that when I finally made my move, there wouldn't be any room for them to spin the narrative in their favor. I met with a divorce lawyer named Rebecca King on a cold morning 2 weeks later. The first thing she said when I walked into her office was that I looked tired. I told her I hadn't been sleeping much, which was true, and she nodded like she'd heard that 1,000 times. Rebecca had a reputation for being ruthless, the kind of attorney who didn't waste time on sympathy or small talk. When I laid out Marcus's folder on her desk, she spent 40 minutes going through every page without a word. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious, but not surprised, like she'd seen this exact scenario play out with different names and faces more times than she could count. "You're not in a marriage. You're in a war," she said. Something about hearing it stated that plainly made everything feel more real. We spent the next 3 hours building a strategy, going through financial records, talking about how to protect assets and reputation when the other side was already planning to destroy both. Rebecca was methodical, asking questions I hadn't thought of, finding holes in my documentation that needed filling, making me realize that being right wasn't enough if I couldn't prove it in a way that would hold up under scrutiny. She told me to keep acting normal. Don't let Chloe know I was onto her. Don't confront anyone or make accusations. Just gather more evidence and wait for the right moment to file. The hardest part was going home that night and pretending everything was fine, sitting across from Chloe at dinner while she talked about her day, knowing she was probably texting Liam the second I left the room. 2 days later, Chloe came home from work early, which was unusual, and dropped a manila envelope on the kitchen table. "Just sign. I've endured enough," she said, her voice tight with frustration, like I was being difficult by existing in her space. I opened the envelope and found divorce papers already filled out with laughably one-sided terms. She wanted the house, the car, most of our savings, and even a clause about me covering her legal fees. There was a paragraph about my supposed emotional instability, carefully worded to sound reasonable while painting me as someone difficult for years. I read the whole thing slowly, watching Chloe's face grow more impatient with every page. When I finished, I sat it down and told her I needed time to think about it. She looked genuinely shocked, like she'd expected me to sign immediately and thank her for making it easy. "There's nothing to think about," she said, her voice sharpening. "This is what's happening, Noah. You can either make it simple or make it ugly." I told her I'd have my lawyer look at it, keeping my voice calm and neutral. She actually laughed at that, a bitter sound that told me she thought I was bluffing. She didn't know I'd already been working with Rebecca for weeks, didn't know about Marcus's folder or the evidence I'd been collecting. She still believed I was the same passive guy who'd let her push him away at that party without saying a word. The breaking point came 3 days later when Chloe's family called a meeting at her parents' house. One of those formal sit-downs clearly meant to be an intervention. I showed up because refusing would have tipped my hand. The second I walked in, I could tell from everyone's faces that they'd already decided how this was going to go. Susan sat at the head of the table like a judge. David, Chloe's father, stood behind her, looking uncomfortable but compliant. Grace was there, but wouldn't meet my eyes. And Chloe sat next to Liam, which was bold, even by their standards. They'd actually invited him to a family meeting about their daughter's marriage, and nobody seemed to think that was strange. Susan started talking about how marriages sometimes run their course, how Chloe deserved to be happy, how I needed to accept that this relationship had reached its natural end. David added something about respecting Chloe's choices and not dragging things out unnecessarily. Liam didn't say anything, but his presence said everything, a quiet confirmation that he was already part of the family, and I was just a problem to be solved. I sat there listening, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions that made them think I was coming around. Grace looked miserable, kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closing it again. When Susan finally asked if I understood what they were telling me, I said yes, I understood perfectly. I saw the relief on all their faces, except Grace's, who looked like she might cry. That night, I called Rebecca and told her it was time to move. The next morning, before Chloe even woke up, I filed for divorce with all of Marcus's evidence attached. Rebecca had prepared everything perfectly, a comprehensive filing that included photos, bank statements, phone records, witness testimonies, and a detailed timeline of Chloe's affair and the conspiracy to defraud me. I had copies delivered to Chloe at her office, to Liam at his desk 3 floors up, to Susan and David's house, even to the HR department at Chloe's company since their affair violated about 6 different workplace policies. By noon, my phone was exploding with calls and texts that I ignored. By evening, Chloe showed up at the house in a state I'd never seen her in before. She wasn't angry or defensive. She was panicking, her voice shaking as she demanded to know where I got all that information and why I was doing this to her. "You didn't betray me by loving someone else," I said, and something about finally saying it made my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "You betrayed me because you thought I'd never stand up for myself." She tried to argue, tried to spin it like I was overreacting or misunderstanding what the evidence showed, but there was no conviction behind her words anymore. Liam had apparently already lawyered up and stopped returning her calls. Susan had left 3 increasingly frantic voicemails about needing to talk immediately. Chloe's company had put both her and Liam on administrative leave, pending an investigation. Everything she'd built, this whole carefully constructed plan to exit our marriage on her terms while making me look like the problem, had collapsed in less than 12 hours because she'd underestimated me so completely she didn't bother covering her tracks. The divorce took 4 months to finalize, faster than usual because Chloe's lawyer knew they had no defense against the evidence Rebecca presented. Chloe tried to negotiate a few times, wanted to settle quietly and avoid a trial, but Rebecca advised me to let it go to court, and I'm glad I listened. The judge wasn't sympathetic to someone who'd planned to commit fraud while conducting an affair with a coworker, and the final settlement was about as fair as these things ever get. I kept the house. We split the savings equally after Chloe paid back what she'd moved into her secret account, and she ended up covering most of her own legal fees. Liam got fired after the company investigation confirmed multiple policy violations, and last I heard, he and Chloe weren't together anymore. Apparently, relationships built on deception don't hold up well under pressure. Susan stopped calling after the settlement was finalized, which was honestly a relief. Grace reached out a few months later to apologize again. I told her I understood she'd been in an impossible position, which was mostly true, and we still talk occasionally, though things will probably never be quite the same. 6 months after the divorce was final, I moved into a smaller apartment downtown. One of those modern places with big windows and hardwood floors that doesn't have any memories attached to it. I make tea in the mornings and sit by the window, watching the city wake up. Sometimes I think about that night at the party, when Chloe pushed me away, and how completely different my life is now. I didn't exactly win. Winning would mean none of this ever happened. But I stopped losing myself trying to save something that was already dead. Some mornings, the anger still burns, thinking about the time I wasted, the lies I believed, how an entire family conspired to make me doubt my own reality. But most days, there's just this quiet. The good kind of quiet, the one that comes from finally knowing exactly who you are, and not apologizing for it anymore. What would you have done in my shoes?